Hello, everyone. This is Sheridan. Sheridan is a PM at Dropbox and a graduate of Northwestern University. So, Sheridan, why don't you just start off by telling us a bit about your background and how you found out about PM?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey guys, Sheridan Clayborne. Just started about 2 months ago at Dropbox. I'm part of their new grad PM program. So previously, I'd actually worked in a bit of a different sector. So I'd spent some time at JP Morgan and at Goldman Sachs where I was doing private equity. For me, like the way I kind of heard about product management was a little bit through chance. While I was spending time at Goldman, a lot of what we were doing was like researching these like early stage startups and a bit like of later stage companies. And I remember thinking to myself that it was really, really interesting being able to see all these founders and kind of people who were building these amazing products. But I was a little bit more interested in the side of being the one who was actually building those products versus being the person who was just like providing the capital for the people who were building those really amazing products. So did a little bit more digging, was trying to find roles in tech that would kind of fit that idea of like building products. And I just found like a bunch of articles on product management. And at first it was a lot to take in. Like there was like a bunch of books that were recommended to me. There was like all these different programs. It was really unclear to figure out like what tech company actually had like a product management job. It was also unclear like what that interview was actually like. Like, did I have to study up on all these like technical resources, or is it just like, let's talk about startup stuff for half the time and that's enough? But yeah, I probably went through the process a little later in the stage than most and learned about product management around like what would have been like June or July, coming into my like senior year of college.
Oh, wow. So you actually found out about like pretty late. Like for me, I heard about what Google APM was when I was at my freshman internship and kind of had that clear idea that product management was the end goal. So you didn't even know about it until halfway through the summer going into senior year.
Yeah, I'd say like I started looking into it. Yeah, that was probably the right time. It was about like halfway through my junior year internship. That's when I started looking at programs for that. And I think I only even started applying in like sometime probably in August, like when my internship ended.
So going back a little bit, what did you major in, and what were your internships throughout school, and what were you doing in school that really helped set you up to be successful in recruiting?
Yeah, for sure. So I majored in computer science and economics. Computer science, I'm sure, kind of as a lot of people know, is relatively useful for product management, especially if you're working on software companies. Just having a good like technical grasp of what's going on, and also just showing that you're like interested in software as a whole is always pretty useful. I think my internships were really useful in the sense is that a lot of what they taught me is kind of what I wasn't interested in. So like when I was at JP Morgan, I realized that wealth management just really wasn't for me. I didn't necessarily find it useful. I didn't really feel like I was providing a lot of value. When I was at Goldman, it still wasn't the right fit, but that started to help me piece together a little bit more of like, all right, what I'm trying to do. I realized that kind of as I was mentioning, talking with all of these really, really passionate founders and seeing just like the way they're trying to go about pitching themselves for how they're going to change the world was super, super fascinating to me. But the part I was the most fascinated about was kind of thinking internally, like, oh, how could I build that same thing? And it also gave me a good idea of like the kind of sectors that I was interested in. I think I found software as a service businesses really interesting. I thought consumer brands were appealing because of their ability for like this like really, really massive growth. But to me, they just seemed very unpredictable and kind of uncontrollable, which is effectively just, it was kind of lucky. So whenever those brands popped up, to me, it seemed a little bit more of like lightning in a bottle instead of like a business like Dropbox, for example, where it's a little bit more of like controlled growth. Yeah, and then I think the biggest thing that kind of helped me figure out that like product management was the right fit for me is on top of startups, on top of like having done internships in finance, I spent the majority of my college career just doing startups. So I'd run the gamut of probably 20 different side projects. I initially sold like Pokemon Go accounts because Pokemon Go was really hot, and I had like a way of like leveling up Pokemon Go accounts really quickly. That ended up transitioning into a business called Follower Stack. So like I would build these bots which were capable of like helping people get a lot more followers online. So like made a little bit of money there. Then I had a couple buddies who were like buying sneakers. They were talking about, hey, like look at the margins, they're crazy. You can like buy a shoe for 200, sell it for 1,000. And I'm like, damn, those are really stupid looking shoes, but like can't believe those are worth 1,000. Like that's kind of crazy. So I ended up like building some programs which were capable of like buying those before they sold out. And then started getting like transitioning a little bit more into like more like traditional scalable startups. So like now I've been like actively pursuing a marketplace in which we provide a vehicle for people who are looking to get tattoos and tattoo artists to match. So like we're providing scheduling services to make it easier for tattoo artists to actually connect with the users who are trying to book with them. And we're also making it easier for people who are looking to get tattoos to go through the very daunting process of like finding the right artist for you and figuring out like where you need to go and what are the steps.
Yeah, no, I mean that's nuts because I mean most people I think really develop the skills to be a product manager at their internships, but I think you really did it kind of like mostly on your own through those businesses. And really the best way I think to prepare to be a product manager is just doing your own side project and going from idea to final, iterating on it, and then kind of building it out based on feedback. Because I don't know if correct me if I'm wrong, but do you really think finance helps you be a better product manager?
I think the only part it did help with is when it comes to like there are some projects you can be on which are much more technical. There's also some which are a little bit more growth minded, and finance definitely taught me like how to be very, very strict about the numbers, how like the numbers can at times be like the source of truth for a business. So I think it can provide value, but it's a little bit more nebulous about it can provide value if you utilize it in the right way, is the way I'd put it. I don't use my finance knowledge all too much in my current job.
Got it. So take us through that story. So you're in July, going to be a senior in college. How did you start preparing for product management? How did you decide which companies that were really like your top choice? And what was going through that whole interview process like?
Yeah, so I'd say my top choice companies initially was any company that's willing to interview me. So I pretty much just applied everywhere. I think I found some spreadsheet which showed like all of the PM places which were hiring. And I think I just put together like a bunch of different resumes which were like kind of tailored to each company, or like it was like sets of resumes for it, and then I just like blasted out as many as I possibly could. From there, like once I actually started hearing back from some companies, then it was a little bit more about like there was a couple things I was trying to optimize for. One, kind of as I was mentioning, I was pretty interested in like SaaS businesses. I just thought that when I was looking at the kind of businesses I saw myself running, I found the consumer space very appealing because, again, of this like massive growth. But to me, it just didn't seem like something that was as replicable. Again, very lightning in the bottle-y, kind of very lucky. I mean, I thought that my core proficiency was more around like SaaS businesses, so I knew I kind of wanted to focus there. I cared, and I know people talk about this a lot, but like the team of people I was surrounded with was something I like heavily was looking for. So I wanted to make sure that I was surrounded by people who were very ambitious, who were like working in a somewhat like nebulous product space, who were cool with ambiguity, which is also why I was looking for a little bit more of a smaller company. So I felt like at a larger organization, it would be a little bit more bureaucratic. So the trade-offs I was making there was, at a company like Google or Facebook or Microsoft, you are pushing it out to what is effectively hundreds of millions, if not billions of users. Where at a smaller company, you might not necessarily have that same size, but there might be a little bit more, less bureaucracy to cut through, and therefore you can move a little bit more quickly on like building and iterating products. So for me, I cared about the moving quickly a little bit more than I did about like the massive scale. And then I'm trying to think if there's any other optimizations I was kind of making. No, at first it was really just like, who the fuck's going to give me a job? Mm-hmm. For development.
So what about like preparing for interviews? Like how'd you go about that?
Yeah. So at the time I was also running, like I kind of had figured out that I didn't necessarily want to stay in finance. A lot of the interview prep I was doing was like I did a lot of stuff for consulting, which actually had a decent amount of crossover with some of the PM interviews. And then like reading, cracking the coding interview, I think there was something called, what was the website? Stellar Peers. Yeah, I think that was a super great way of like finding out other people who were like doing product management interviews, because that was one problem I had. Like I had a lot of friends who were doing consulting interviews. I knew like one or two other people who were going through product management interviews, so it was a little bit harder to get reps in for doing that. But certainly being able to find someone who I could like run through reps of product management interviews with was super, super important. I think it's like the more chances you get to do it, like that was one thing that was really surprising me. I think like initially when I was looking at the questions of like, how would you design a better Facebook app, or, any question along that vein, I was really ready for that. I'm like, oh, I've had, 4 years of startup experience. Like I'm gonna fucking crush it out of the park. I'm gonna fire from the hip. Like I'm good to go. Ended up quickly realizing that just spouting off like 500 different features that you can think off the top of your head might sound really dope to you, and you might think you're the man, but in reality is kind of just nonsense. And if you're not saying it with a level of structure and a level of like empathy for the customer, that's all it'll come off as to the interviewer. It'll just sound like nonsense. It sounds like you're just trying to make up ideas. And I think that was the first thing that I kind of had to realize, is that product management isn't necessarily just being like the idea guy in the room. It's more being the execution person in the room. So realizing like, who's the customer? What are the different ideas we can use to kind of solve this problem? What's the right problem? How do we solve and track it, and how do we iterate it over time? So realizing that it was less ambiguous and there was actually more structure than I thought there was.
Got it. So yeah, no, I mean, definitely the same thing. Like mock interviews for me, I did an absurd amount. I actually used Lewis Lynn's Slack group instead. Now interviewing with companies, like what companies did you end up interviewing with, and what were the experiences with them like?
Yeah, so I on the PM side, I ended up interviewing with Uber, Yahoo, Dropbox, Twitter, and Indeed and Roblox. I got very hard no's from Roblox and Uber. I was heartbroken about both. The one for Uber this is a funny story, and I was dying. So like I made it past the first round, and then they ended up giving us this like written presentation where we had to talk about like how would we design some better feature for Uber, which wasn't a big deal. I think like a lot of candidates ended up making it through to that portion. And I remember one time being in Uber, like getting like free snacks from this thing that was like a little cargo machine.
Yeah.
I'm like, that was the coolest thing ever. Like, I love that. Why does every Uber not have this? So I'm like, great, I'll just create a product feature around that. Write up a whole 8-page document, submit it to them, get the feedback. The harshest feedback I've ever gotten to anything I've ever submitted ever. It was just like, didn't we already build this product experience? ... question mark.
Yeah, no, that's brutal. I mean, honestly, the same thing happened to me with Lyft, similar. I didn't really know, for me personally, like I didn't really know what, I can't remember what the name is, but like you rent a car, Zipcar. I didn't really know what Zipcar was. So I actually basically pitched Zipcar for Lyft, and they came back and it was like too similar to Zipcar was my feedback. I got Uber though, so. Okay, so what about with Dropbox? Were you comparing any offers, or was Dropbox like the only PM offer you ended up getting?
Yeah, so I had offers from Indeed, Yahoo, and Dropbox.
Okay.
And then I think I was still in the process with what was it the company was? I was still in the process with one other PM place. Like there was a couple things I was like looking at. One was really just culture. I think like being like the location of San Francisco was really important to me. The culture of people there, people were just like, everyone there was just like oozing with enthusiasm about like trying to help. And that's what I really cared about. Like it was a group of people who legitimately seemed like they were incentivized to actually help each other out. And it really seemed like there was a culture of just like working on these pretty like broad initiatives. And I think also I was just like relatively passionate for the actual product itself. So I think Dropbox has done a great job of building like a core technical product. I think like file sync and share and like file storage is a very technical space. And that's something that I hadn't necessarily had as much exposure to, but was really looking to get out of a place that I was working at. Like some of the other considerations was like pay was certainly relevant. Dropbox was good in that category. But yeah, it was really just like the people I was working with. Everyone was incredibly smart. There were people who were just working on some really, especially, and I think this was might have been a negative to some people, but I looked at it as a positive. I actually liked the fact that Dropbox was in a not necessarily so great position. So like revenues have been going up, like they've been getting more profitable, but as everyone kind of knows, like the file storage space has effectively been commoditized to a degree. And it's not like that's going to stop in any time. You've got players like Google, Microsoft, Apple, pick and choose any other 50 companies which are doing like some version of file storage at this point. So Dropbox back was kind of against the wall in the fact where they had to make new products. Like if Dropbox, doesn't effectively come out with a new product within the next couple of years, like they are really going to be in a bad spot. And I think that was clear from kind of leadership too, where it was like they're cognizant of that. And we're actively pursuing to kind of push out, like, for example, like the Gemini launch we just had was like the largest product launch that Dropbox has done in like 6 years, because they're really trying to push for new initiatives. So that's something I was optimizing for too.
Yeah, and honestly, so I was actually turned off from Dropbox. This is like, I never use their products, so that's not a place for me. But that honestly is a really good point that I actually hadn't thought of. That I think it's really, really cool to be in a place that has that like type of innovation. So now that you've gotten your offer, you've taken it, you chilled at school for a year, what has it been like being a product manager at Dropbox, and why do you think that Dropbox specifically has a really unique product management program?
Why does Dropbox specifically have a very... Okay, so couple things. I think one thing that I've heard about a lot of the product management positions, especially at the new grad level, is that they're rotational. So Dropbox doesn't have that. Like when you start, they effectively say like you are a full PM now. But really all that ends up meaning is that like the team that you are placed on is the team that you are going to be building products for. And the only time that you'll switch off is if you are like actively requesting to switch off. So really what that ends up coming down to is that the projects you're working on now are going to the projects that, if done well, you're going to continue to work on kind of throughout. And I think that was really nice to have right off the cuff. So like without going too much into detail about what I'm working on now, it was a product which, wait, let me think about how I should talk about this. Okay, I guess to talk about it more broadly, it kind of lays the foundation for a lot of the machine learning work that we're trying to push out and put at the forefront of like what our users are seeing. And that's been really interesting. I think one of the things I've had to get used to is the ways in which, not necessarily working through bureaucracy, but it's like figuring out the right like cross-functional partners to work with at any given point in time. And I didn't realize how important that was. Like when I'd done startups in the past, I was always kind of used to like, hey, I've got this idea, I'm gonna go on and execute it. If it doesn't work, I'm gonna go back and that's okay. I can do it 5 more times and I can be up all night and kind of go through that. And I think the reason processes like that don't work here is because you could be pushing out features to tens of millions of users. If for whatever reason that product doesn't work, or for whatever reason you're not able to actively track it, or you don't actually know what's happening with it, or you don't have a good thesis on why you're building the product, it can fail and break in many ways. And especially you're wasting a lot of engineering time. So you're wasting a lot of time building something that could be irrelevant or that you don't have any strong thesis on. So I think it's being a lot more structured and thoughtful about the products that I'm building and the things that I'm working on has been really interesting. And then just like time management, it's kind of crazy how easy it is to get just like caught up in the day of just like having meetings on all these different ways of like scoping out projects and just being very, very exact about like, this is what I'm going to focus on today. Like these are the importance, these are the meetings that matter to me the most, and here's the projects that matter to me the most. So time management has been like a thing I've certainly had to learn on the job.
Got it. So why do you think that like Dropbox is, well, I guess a better question is, what is the trade-offs for rotational versus non-rotational programs? Because I had to make that same decision.
Yeah, I don't know if I can, are you is Microsoft a rotational program?
Microsoft does not have a rotational program.
Okay, at least what I've heard from other people is that rotational projects can be interesting because like, let's just say, for example, you're placed on a team that you don't necessarily want to be on. There was a little bit less pressure. Like, for example, I really, and I mean this genuinely, I'm very happy with the team I'm currently placed on. But in the event that I wasn't, I think it would be a little uncomfortable for me to figure out how I would move off it, because there's no like clearly defined path, especially for doing that in the first 6 months. So I think that's one thing that people might struggle with. Also the idea that I'm sure there might be some trade-off between like actual execution and learning, whereas like I think Google's APM program is like heavily focused on, to the best of my knowledge, like learning as much about being a product manager as you can, and then like really only focusing on executing at the end of like the rotational program. Whereas this is a little bit more focused on the execution side, because it's like you're effectively working on the products that you're going to be building for however many years you end up staying on that team. Um, I personally cared a lot more about like I wanted to be working on projects which delivered a meaningful impact as quickly as I possibly could. Um, I'm someone who like certainly valued the learning, but even just to like boost my own ego, it'd make me feel a lot better if I was working on like really impactful projects. Um, because it's my baby. So yeah, I think that was the trade-off I was making. But honestly, I don't know as much about rotational programs, so it's hard for me to talk too deeply about it. Yeah.
Got it. So if you could go back and do recruiting for product management all over again, or if you have any advice for people, what would that be?
Oh, interesting. I think one piece of advice I could give for people is I think a lot of people are concerned if they don't have like a super technical background, or even if they don't have like a startup background. And I think one thing I've realized, like being able to go through like seeing the other side of the table now of like being on actual interviews, where, like I'm talking with potential new grad candidates, is that they are so open to a wide array of experiences. So you could have had, like been some part of a club where you want a leadership organization, been in some hackathon where you're working on a project, done some random side project, done an art installation. Really any way, and I don't know if this is the case for other companies, but at least for Dropbox, and I'm sure some other PM places, as long as you can show that you can work with cross-functional people, as long as you can like figure out like find a project that you're passionate about and show how you actually went about like going and executing on that with a wide array of people. And you don't even necessarily need to be the leader. Like you don't need to be the one who's like forcing every decision and making it happen. It's almost better to show like, hey, here's where I stood within the team and here's how I made it. So everything else kind of gelled and like moved together. That was one thing I kind of didn't realize. I thought I was going to be much more on like, hey, here's the specific engineering project I've done, and that's what all they would evaluate it on. I think if I would have done it over again, I would have tried to. I didn't realize how important it was to like really think and empathize with the user as much as you possibly can. I still had this mindset of like, I'm going to think of as many feature ideas as I possibly can and kind of just like throw it out there, where I should have been much more around like, what is the problem space? Like, what is the actual story of the user that we're trying to pitch for? Like, what are the pain points that they're experiencing and how do we develop an experience around that? Versus just like, hey, here's 100 different product ideas that would work for someone like me.
Got it. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, especially on the point about just like launching projects, working with different people. You sold sneakers, I sold plastic keyboard stands. Everyone kind of has their own way of doing things. But that's all the questions I have for you. I think it was super helpful talking to you, and I think a lot of people benefit. Is there anything else that you want to add or say?
Don't
feel
really
pressured to answer.
I'd say it's also really just a numbers game. So like, don't be worried when you get, if you end up applying to a bunch of places, don't worry if you get denied. There are so many people applying, and at a lot of these places, so few spots open, that a lot of the time there could be 100 relatively qualified candidates that they're picking from to get to 7 spots. So a lot of the time it's just chance if you get denied. So apply to as many places as possible, and then have a great time sorting through offers when you get them.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more with you, Sheridan. And thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, absolutely. See you on.
All right, there we go, Sheridan.